Well, first, I was surprised that we saw them in public view because they're all classified. 29 files that were obtained by the London Financial Times, dated between 2008 to 2014. So they're not written today, but they were all written during the Putin era, so they're still relevant. And the main burden of these documents was to show that the Russians were preparing all sorts of scenarios in which they were preparing to use tactical nuclear weapons. And the two main themes, I thought, were, one, how much emphasis, training and practice they put into preparing for an invasion across their border, the Russian border, from China. They share a very long 4,000-kilometre border, and the Russians were obviously acutely nervous about that, and they had a plan that if the Chinese were to invade, Russia would use a tactical, that is a battlefield, not a strategic, not a city-destroying nuclear weapon, but a smaller battlefield nuclear weapon against Chinese troops. That was one. And the other was they set out a whole range of thresholds and scenarios in which they would be prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons.
So how is Beijing reacting? Was it surprised, do you think?
I'm sure that the Chinese Communist Party's surveillance system has been equally wary of Russia over the years. I mean, for example, they were at war once in 1969. They had a furious border war. The Russians then, we know as a historical fact, considered using nuclear weapons against China then. So you can be pretty sure the Chinese have been keeping a wary eye on the Russians. But to have these documents published is pretty striking, is pretty remarkable, and the Chinese have merely emphasised that today China and Russia have a very strong so-called no limits partnership, and all is well and nothing to fear.
Well, tell us more about this relationship and how it appears currently.
Well, 2 years ago, just before Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine in full force, he signed this pact with Xi Jinping in Beijing called the No Limits Partnership. And it's a very long 5,000-word document, very ideological. It identified the two regimes, the Chinese Communist Party and the Russian government. The main theme of their partnership was to unite against a common enemy, which is, of course, the US and NATO. So it's a marriage of convenience. And if you look at their history, a very checkered history, where Russia and China have been, friends for one phase, enemies for another, back into friendship and so on. This is a marriage of convenience where it suits each of them to partner up to try to establish as much control as possible over world affairs, to assert their expansionist ambitions. China into the South China Sea, into the East China Sea, so we're talking about all of the, and down through Southeast Asia, so we're talking about all of the periphery of the Chinese mainland. And Russia, of course, wants Ukraine and maybe further west. So they've come together to support each other through that phase. But when that phase ends, what these documents reinforce to us is that we shouldn't be surprised if we see Russia and China once again go separate ways and perhaps even become foes again. And the last thing I'd say on that, Yvonne, is that even last year, when this No Limits partnership was, apparently in full force, Russia still tested twice a nuclear-capable missile, the Iskander missile, along its border with China.
So it's really quite unpredictable in terms of their relationship going forward. What might this all tell us about what might happen, what it means for Russia's invasion of Ukraine? The fact that it has been revealed that the lengths it will go to eliminate its perceived threats.
Yeah, that's the very current point where we can apply these documents. These documents suggested that Russia, in that phase, was much readier to use tactical nuclear weapons than its declared policy or general expectations sat. So where so far Putin has time and again rattled the sabre, rattled the nuclear cage, if you like, and threatened to use nuclear weapons, it's turned out that every time in these last 2 years of the Ukraine war, he has been bluffing. And the West, NATO, has called his bluff and continued to ratchet up the support it gives to Ukraine. But what these documents tell us is that one day Maybe it won't be bluff. The documents show that the Russians were considering using tactical nuclear weapons in the event that they lost, for example, if they lost 20% of their ballistic missile submarines. And if an enemy force were to lodge on Russian soil and the Russian border force is incapable of defending, they would use a tactical nuclear weapon. Well, some of those criteria have been met or are close to being met already in Ukraine. So perhaps the nuclear threat is more present and real than we were beginning to think.
Mm. Well, while we're on leaked documents or information, Russia is threatening Germany over a leaked call between military officials. What can you tell us about this, and also Germany's reaction?
Yes, so this was a conversation between senior German military officials where they thought they were having a secret conversation. I don't know how they got that impression, because they were using an open internet platform. Highly imprudent of them. The Russians intercepted it, and the Russians leaked the recording. And the point of this, I think, was Russia saying, listen, you Germans, we know what you're up to. And what the recording revealed was that the Germans were first making potential plans for deploying a new cruise missile called the Taurus missile against Russia in Ukraine, giving it to the Ukrainians. Second, the Germans let slip that the British already have military operatives active in Ukraine. So these are NATO troops operating on the ground in Ukraine. And the Russians used this leak, which they'd themselves leaked, as a pretext to issue a warning against the Germans, to say, don't even think about anything further, any NATO troops on Ukrainian soil, and you will be at war with Russia.
Mm. Really fascinating developments there. Meanwhile, turning our attention to this region here, we of course are hosting world leaders from Southeast Asia in Australia. Anthony Albanese has met with them today. What are the main takeaways, do you think, from this ASEAN summit?
Well, the point of the whole summit, the reason they're here, ostensibly to celebrate 50 years of Australian association with ASEAN, but the real point is the reason that Australia is doing it and that they're here is to diversify. For Australia to diversify our trade after finding ourselves very imprudently over-dependent on China for our export markets and therefore vulnerable. And for the ASEAN countries, they too are looking for diversification. The former leader of Cambodia just a year or so ago said, we have to give in to the Chinese, because who else is going to give us the money? So this is an attempt by Australia to say, well, we can also help with infrastructure, with clean energy. We can also be a partner. We can help you to diversify. You have an Australian option, not just a China or US option. So for both sides, it's been a diversification exercise.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for coming into this studio. Really appreciate you and your analysis tonight.
It's a pleasure to see you face to face, Yvonne.